It is the summer of 1645, and Edinburgh's old town is suffering a scourge of biblical proportions as the city is experiencing an outbreak of bubonic plague, or, as it had been labelled during previous outbreaks, the Black Death. In an upper room of a narrow building in the old town, a sick woman is writhing on a small wooden bed. Her bedclothes and sheets are damp with sweat, and her pale skin is stretched across painfully swollen glands. To her side, a female relative is frantically nailing a torn piece of white sheet across a wooden window frame. A piece of the same fabric is tied across her face in a makeshift mask. With her task complete, she moves closer to the bedside, but not too close. She has already watched 3 members of her family be taken by this wretched disease and knows how quickly it can spread. Just 2 days earlier, the woman in the bed had been complaining of a mild fever, and now she had agonising cramps, swollen glands, and had vomited until she could produce nothing more than lurid yellow bile. "You'll be better soon, Lizzie," she says nervously. "I've signalled for the doctor. He's in the street outside." If the woman thrashing around the bed understood what her sister had said, it did little to calm her. The area around her neck is so inflamed by the dangerously swollen glands that it's starting to restrict her breathing. Unable to speak, the woman simply cries and groans, clawing at the bedding and thrashing her head from side to side. Suddenly, the cries and groaning are interrupted by 3 booming knocks on the fragile bedroom door. "See, Lizzie, I tell you he'd come. That'll be the doctor now," the woman in the mask says as she rushes to the bedroom door. As she raises the latch and then opens the door, the woman has to stifle her own gasp of fear. The bare wooden floorboards creak as a tall, cloaked figure steps inside like the angel of death entering the small room. It's impossible to discern any human features beneath the huge, crow-like mask with its hooked beak and dark glass eyes. His leather coat stretches to the floor, and in his gloved hand he carries a long spiked stick. As the doctor moves purposely towards the bed, the patient breaks out of her fever dream for just long enough to notice the approaching visitor. Her dark eyes widen in horror, and she begins to scream. I'm Norman Brown, and you're listening to the Scary Scotland podcast, where we delve into the darker corners of Scottish legends and make connections with the wider world and culture. Tonight, in episode 2, The Doctor's Knock, we travel to a plague-ravaged Edinburgh of the 17th century, where 2 men were brave or desperate enough to pull on a cloak and beaked mask and adopt the terrifying role of plague doctor, where they walked amongst the sick and dying to alleviate the suffering of plague victims. We will explore how difficult life in Edinburgh was at this time, and how the plague doctors became a powerful symbol for a time of real-life horror which wiped out half the population of the city. So make yourself comfortable, and come with me back through the centuries to visit Edinburgh of the past. Today, Edinburgh is a beautiful and beguiling city, which seems distinctly European. It spans the Gothic alleyways spiralling down from the formidable castle to the carefully considered geometry and opulence of the new town. It has inspired a range of novels and been the setting for many films. And of course, every year Edinburgh plays host to a world-famous arts festival, and then the mother of all Hogmanay celebrations. But you do not need to venture very far from the mournful bagpipes echoing around Waverley Station or the tartan-festooned shops of the Royal Mile to come face to face with a different Edinburgh. From the locations of witch trials to the citywide defences against grave robbers, from places famed for public executions to its haunted underground vaults, links to Edinburgh's shadowy past run through the city like a network of darkness. And even among such a catalogue of horrors, one period stands out as a particularly dark and dangerous time to be alive. During the 17th century, Edinburgh's old town was a bustling but dangerously overcrowded area. The population of the city lived literally on top of one another and impressive tenements that towered up to 11 stories high, making them some of the tallest homes in Europe at the time, and the precursor of the modern residential skyscrapers. These tall buildings, known as lands, were home to people from all walks of life, with the wealthiest residing on the middle floor and the poorest on the ground and uppermost levels. You can even visit a restored version of one such building today. It's known as Gladstone's Land, located in the Lawn Market section of the Royal Mile. This slice of life in the 17th century features fully restored rooms, much as they would have been 400 years ago. However, the building also now thankfully includes modern holiday accommodation and an ice cream parlour, but things were much less luxurious 400 years ago. Between the lands, the streets of the old town formed a web of narrow wynds and closes, lanes and alleys, which were overshadowed by the towering buildings. These thoroughfares were poorly maintained, if maintained at all, and this created a shadowy labyrinth with little natural light at ground level, and street lamps would not be installed in the capital for another 40 years. Open sewers ran through the middle of many streets, contributing to seriously unsanitary conditions. Drinking water was sourced from communal wells, and waste was often disposed of by throwing it into the streets with a cry of "Gardez-le!" This call would immediately be followed by a warm splatter as a stinking bucket of excrement and urine was tipped from some open window. This daily practice meant that there was a constant stream of sewage running from the top of the town, washed by the relentless rain back into any drinking wells, before finally pouring into the large body of stagnant water known as the Nor Loch. This stinking broth, located where today the Princes Street Gardens are, was also contaminated with the runoff from local slaughterhouses and butchers of the flesh market. And this toxic loch soon became so polluted that it gave rise to a permanent stinking haze, and spawned Edinburgh's less than flattering nickname of Auld Reekie. Yet even with the dangerously poor sanitation, the Old Town was the heart of Edinburgh's social and economic activity. Its proximity to the High Street and the Royal Mile meant that it was a centre of trade, politics and culture. Markets thrived, with merchants selling goods ranging from fresh produce to richly coloured textiles. Taverns and inns were popular gathering places where people would huddle around smoky fireplaces to enjoy ale and good company. Although they did not know why, it was generally known that ale would not make people as sick as drinking water. In truth, this was because the process of brewing required that the water be boiled, therefore killing off any bacteria that was present in most drinking water. And for those not fortunate enough to be enjoying a tankard or two of ale, things were not so cheery, because despite the vibrancy, life in the Old Town was also difficult for many. Poverty was widespread, and disease was a constant threat due to the overcrowding and the unsanitary conditions. In many cases, poorer families would share the lower floor of their homes with animals such as pigs, goats and sheep, meaning that human and animal waste was an ever-present feature in communal stairwells. And when diseases would occur, as they often did, the lack of real medical knowledge, even amongst doctors, and the absence of public health infrastructure exacerbated the problem. Remember, this was a world without anaesthetic, disinfectant, analgesics or antibiotics, the absence of which had a negative impact on life expectancy and health, and all of that was before the arrival of the plague. The plague was a recurring threat in Edinburgh during the 1700s, with outbreaks devastating the population and altering the city's daily life. But the midpoint in the century was definitely the worst. 1645 was already a time of scarcity and hardship because the previous harvest had failed, so locals were looking towards this year as a time when their lives might finally improve. This could not be further from the truth. From spring of that year, a few apparently isolated cases of bubonic plague, named after the buboes or boils it created throughout the bodies of its victims, had appeared. However, in the middle of May there was an outbreak in the relatively new King James's Hospital in Leith, and this marked the real start of the epidemic. It spread rapidly in the cramped and muck-smeared streets and closes of the Old Town, where residents had little defence against this terrifying and often fatal disease. For those who contracted the disease, it was common for their illness to progress from a mild flu-like fever, then severe aches and pains, to infection, boils, vomiting, gangrene and finally death in a matter of days. In the Leith area alone, half the population died in less than a 6-month period. As the bodies began to pile up, fear of contagion quickly led wealthier residents to gather up their belongings and quickly flee the city, leaving the remaining poorer population to bear the brunt of the disease. Markets and businesses, which had previously served as the lifeblood of the city, would shut down, leading to extreme economic hardship for everyone from porters to street traders and merchants. Throughout such times, it was mainly left to religious leaders of the Kirk to guide the community through the crisis. They often associated the plague with those written about in the Bible, and attributed it to God's judgment being delivered through divine punishment, for which the only certain hope might be repentance and prayer. But that's not to say that leaders of the church and city leaders, alarmed at the speed and impact of the plague, didn't try to respond too with some practical measures. Much like during our recent experience of COVID-19, when the plague struck, authorities implemented measures intended to control its spread, though these were at best partially effective. Quarantine, in which entire households were sealed off if a member of a family contracted the plague, with guards posted to enforce isolation. Another response to the disease was mass burials, in which victims of plague were interred together in mass unmarked graves to prevent further contamination. This disrespectful treatment of the dead would have only added to the agony already felt by those who had lost loved ones to the disease. When not just one member but entire families had passed from plague, cleaning squads were sent in to cleanse and fumigate a property. But this was unpopular and risky work, which few were inclined to carry out, especially after initial participants fell sick with the disease. Given what we know now about how the plague's bacteria was spread through flea bites, and the fact that fleas can live in bedding and other textiles for weeks without a host, it would have been a certainty that any unfortunate cleaners entering a seemingly empty property would be exposed to the disease. Efforts were also made to clean the stinking streets and improve sanitation, though these were rudimentary and limited in effectiveness. People were instructed to take their waste to the Norloch, or better still down to the docks, where it might be tipped into the sea. But remember that plague houses were quarantined, so multiple families could be locked up in a single building, and the waste they produced needed to go somewhere, usually tipped into the street outside via a convenient window. And finally, plague doctors were hired to treat the sick and record deaths, often donning their distinctive protective outfits. The iconic attire of plague doctors was both practical and symbolic. In Edinburgh, as in other parts of Europe, they wore the unique plague doctor costume designed to minimise exposure to miasmas, or bad air, which they believed spread the disease. The costume typically consisted of beaked masks, which featured a long, curving beak filled with aromatic substances like lavender, rose petals or camphor. It was believed that these scents would filter out the harmful miasmas and protect the doctor from infection. They would also wear a hat made of leather or cloth. This was worn to signify the wearer's medical profession, and a long coat, usually made of waxed leather or heavy fabric, which was designed to cover the entire body to prevent direct contact with infected individuals. And of course, gloves and boots further reduced the risk of contamination. And lastly, the plague doctor would carry a staff or a cane, usually wooden, sometimes pointed. It was used to examine patients or to point to objects without having to make physical contact. Plague doctors were tasked with treating the afflicted and curbing the spread of the disease. These doctors were not always qualified physicians. Many were either inexperienced medical practitioners or individuals with some rudimentary knowledge of medicine who simply took up the position due to its relatively high pay and guaranteed work during a time of crisis. The aspects we have discussed already, such as the city's dense population and poor sanitation, made Edinburgh particularly vulnerable to this disease. And so the plague doctors who walked through the empty closes and wynds were responsible not only for treating the sick, but also for recording deaths and identifying potential sources of infection. These duties placed them at significant personal risk, as understanding of disease transmission was in its infancy, and treating the sick required that they get dangerously close to patients. The treatments administered by plague doctors were simple and based on limited medical knowledge. Common methods included bloodletting by using leeches or incisions to balance humours in the body, or herbal remedies, where they administered internal and external mixtures of herbs believed to have healing and purifying properties. As well as this, poultices provided topical treatments to the buboes or swollen lymph nodes, or occasionally they were lanced to release the pressure and were then cauterized to prevent infection. And lastly, quarantining patients by enforcing isolation to prevent the disease spread. Of course, Edinburgh was not alone in having to fight the plague, which was spreading like wildfire across much of Europe. The role and attire of plague doctors in Edinburgh shared many similarities with those in other parts of Europe. For example, the striking design of the plague doctor costume is often attributed to Charles Delorme, a French physician who was working in Italy in the early 1600s. Consequently, Italian plague doctors were amongst the first to adopt the beaked mask and waxed leather garments, which originally were intended to block out miasmas, but ended up being an effective barrier against the actual danger of fleas. In France, French doctors emphasised aromatic remedies, often incorporating regional herbs like thyme and rosemary into their treatments. It is perhaps thanks to the historical links between Scotland and France that aromatics were used in Edinburgh by their plague doctors too. However, in Germany, although similar to those in neighbouring countries, plague doctors' costumes were often much more elaborate, with additional layers of protection, as local physicians placed greater emphasis on shielding the body from miasmas. But despite a common appearance and approach, the work of plague doctors in Edinburgh and across Europe had limited effectiveness in directly combating bubonic plague in individual patients. Their reliance on outdated theories meant that many treatments were ineffective or even harmful. However, the plague doctors' efforts in recording cases and enforcing quarantines were incredibly important and laid the groundwork for more systemic public health measures in later centuries, many of which we experienced directly during the COVID pandemic. So, although the image of the bird-like plague doctor with its eerie beaked mask and sombre attire is clearly a frightening one, this image should also remain a potent symbol of medical history, rather than simply serving as a figure of horror. Whilst their methods were often inadequate, their willingness to serve during times of great peril reflects the resilience and courage of medical professionals. Which takes us to the legacy of one individual plague doctor, who inarguably deserves to be remembered as the man behind the mask. Dr. George Ray took up the role of plague doctor in the summer of 1645, when the disease was at its peak in Edinburgh. At the time of his appointment, on June 13th, his predecessor and Edinburgh's first plague doctor, a man called John Policius, had held the post for only a matter of weeks before succumbing to the disease he was treating and dying of plague himself. This obvious level of risk meant that the city offered a substantial salary for anyone willing to fill the vacancy. It's believed to have been around £100 per month, a huge sum at the time. George Ray stepped forward, and like a modern-day superhero, he pulled on the mask and costume, then got to work fighting an unseen enemy. We can only imagine the level of commitment, resilience and stamina required to spend every day entering cramped, stinking and infected homes to treat the sick and dying. Ray would have had to tend to infants, children, men and women and the elderly, most of whom would have been equally terrified of his shocking attire and the disease that was ravishing their bodies. Ray must have been sweltering inside his costume and struggling to breathe through the filter of dried petals and herbs, whilst trying to deliver agonising treatments such as lancing pus-filled boils and then using a hot poker to cauterise the wound. His patients would undoubtedly have been screaming and clawing at him with infected hands as he tried to complete his work. Even when the difficult treatment was over, Ray would thankfully step outside, only to discover how every other window in the street would display white rags, indicating that another family required his assistance. It must have taken an iron will to continue. And so, until the plague eventually began to burn out, George Ray carried out his grim duties, and when he finally removed the mask for good and approached the city leaders for payment, the good doctor was given the worst possible news. It seemed that there was in fact no great salary set aside, or any salary at all for the plague doctor. It had been cynically assumed by those in charge that any plague doctor would die before his job was completed. And so, from his last day serving the people of Edinburgh, George Ray began a 10-year campaign against the City Council for his rightful payment. Historical accounts differ as to whether or not this unsung hero ever received payment before he died, and sadly, no statue was ever erected in his honour, and to me, that is a great injustice. Ultimately, the work of the plague doctor in Edinburgh was profound, mapping the spread of the plague and highlighting the urgent need for improved public health measures. By the late 1700s, initiatives to modernise the city of Edinburgh began to take shape, including plans for the gleaming new town, which aimed to alleviate overcrowding and improve living conditions. The plague also highlighted the need for better medical knowledge, and within a century, Edinburgh would have established one of the UK's leading medical schools, which, despite having a few literal skeletons in its closet, went on to pioneer the treatment of many previously fatal conditions and diseases. Therefore, in many ways, and like most cities around the world, the Edinburgh that we know and love today is built on the sacrifice and suffering of others. In the case of the plague doctor, George Ray, we have the opportunity to appreciate his contribution, because to do otherwise is, in my view, a mistake. Someday, you might find yourself in the misty lanes of Edinburgh, seeking out a fringe show, a bustling pub in the grass market, or perhaps hoping to enjoy the thrill of a walking ghost tour. But whatever the reason, as you make your way along some foggy cobbled wind between the ancient buildings of the old town, you may just see a dark figure standing half hidden in the shadows up ahead. Perhaps you'll smile and shrug, mistakenly dismissing the cloaked figure as a ghost tour guide, or perhaps a street performer wearing gothic attire, and so you carry on, hurrying along the wind, until it's too late. It's then that you find yourself confronted by the towering masked figure of the plague doctor, a doctor who, like the Pied Piper of Hamelin, was betrayed by the plague-ravaged city he served, and now has returned to claim his payment, a life for each of those he saved. The last thing you see is a leather-gloved hand raising a long spiked stick in the air above your face, before it descends, and once again the plague doctor performs his operation. I'm Norman Brown. Thank you for sharing your time on our journey into the past. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and follow the show on Spotify, Apple Music, or whichever platform you prefer. A new episode will drop every fortnight, so there are many more scary stories to explore. Tonight's episode, The Doctor's Knock, was made possible by Edinburgh Plague and the Plague Doctor from edinburghhistory.co.uk. Edinburgh, the true story, the real Mary King's Close. leithhospital.com. Music was by Alfred Gripesta of A Creative Journey and PG Richmond of Creative Audio. Additional sounds were supplied by the Free Sound community. Thank you all, and stay scared.